Okay, so we are recording, hopefully. So, if you didn't know already, if you're not supposed to be here, this is Networking for Research. It's just a short presentation based on primarily my own experiences, and that's a disclaimer I will put out there. Oh, I'll admit someone else. So this is primarily from my own experience. So it's not related to any of the organizations that I've been in touch with or institutions I've been a part of. So that's big ones put out there first of all. In terms of what we're going to go through today, I'm going to give you a short introduction about who I am, some basics of networking that really only apply to researchers. And then I'm going to give you 3 examples from 3 research topics that I've done, one in Texas, one in London, and then one fun one that I've just started recently. And then we'll just close and have a discussion. So who am I and why on earth should you listen to me? If not, I did my undergraduate at Queen Mary in geography, human geography, which is where I think most of you probably are. I also studied abroad at the University of Texas, Austin, for 5 months, and that kind of feeds very nicely into my dissertation I did. I then kind of went very left field, and I did an MSc in Science and Technology Studies. That's because I was really interested in smart cities. And then by some miraculous magic, I think, I got admitted onto a joint PhD program with the Universities of Manchester and Melbourne to look at urban sustainability and digital platforms. For the first 2 on there, the undergrad and the postgrad, I did 2 dissertations and used interviews as a way to recruit, as a way to do my research. And I was really successful in who I was able to get and how. So hence why I've become somewhat notorious for networking across research and other areas. So who am I and where has my networking kind of started from? LinkedIn, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a primary platform for networking with professionals. And I joined there in 2017. So that the significance of that is to tell you that, it's only been 2-3 years. It's not a long time. I haven't got wealth of experience in industry and those sorts of things, but the people I've been able to connect with and give value to, as well as them to give value to me, has been quite extraordinary in that time. And my network, unlike most of the things that we know about networking and nepotism, my network is completely self-made. Family connections is completely redundant in my instance. I had 2 internships that were somewhat another reason why the network grew. But the kind of timeline periods there of my dissertation research in Fort Worth in July 2018 during my undergrad, my dissertation research in my postgrad during the pandemic, and we'll talk a little bit about the pandemic context. And then the 3rd example, which is more of a fun one, that I started a newsletter on cities because I clearly don't think I have enough to do already. So that's kind of my background in terms of who I am and the networking journey. So the next section we're going to talk about is a networking kind of basics. So we'll talk about these 4 sections, and these should really set you up to try and figure out who your audience is, where they are, and how you can best contact them. So this is a really fun little slide that I've kind of shared a few times in the past. And it's essentially just an explanation of how one can network and where one can network. So we're obviously talking about research today, but there are other ways you can do that. So making content is one. If you want to grow your following on social media or anywhere else, you might make content to do that. Person to person is somewhat similar to research, but the object of which you're networking is much more personal and sometimes much more difficult. Whereas in research, you're kind of isolated from the object of what is being networked. And the value being exchanged. A passion project, if you've got a side hustle or something like that, that can be an opportunity to network. And then events, they're also really good opportunities for research, but normally most of the time we want to be much more direct when we're doing research, networking for research. and so those are just some examples of how you could go about it. And then the modes, I think this is actually fundamentally one of the most important things I hope you're going to get from today. You need to contextualize your audience or who you want to network with the most popular platform they're likely to be associated with. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is if you're trying to connect with professionals who use LinkedIn as showboating, as possibly a way to connect with like-minded individuals, that's where you're going to want to go. But if you're wanting to talk to academics, for example, most of them aren't on LinkedIn unless they've got a professional reason to be. Most of them on Twitter because they can have a more here we go. All right. So sorry, yeah. So someone was just letting someone in there. So if you are networking with academics, for example, Twitter will be a much better place because they can get instant feedback on thoughts and things like that, and that's much better for the academic process. Similarly, they don't get as much value out of LinkedIn because it's sometimes a lot more superficial. But also, if you're not looking at academics, if you're looking more at community groups, you're looking at young people, you're looking at that sort of thing, Instagram might be your community. So you've got to really figure out where your community lives. And you'll likely already know this given the kind of context and the research design that you've done and how you were planning to go about getting participants. The biggest one is obviously cold emailing, and I've used a lot of that in the past, and I can say it definitely does work. You have to use some very, I suppose, quite superficial techniques, but it definitely does work. And if you're interested in general networking with people who are in your area, I'd recommend the app Shaper, so SHAPR. Essentially, it's what I've kind of dubbed Tinder for LinkedIn. So essentially, you like swipe on people who you think you have like interest with, and it's a good way to meet mentors or people who potentially might give you a job if you're looking outside of academia. And I've used it a few times, and I've got some really lifelong mentors from there, which have helped me to grow and what have you. So those are the kind of methods and modes. The massive takeaway from here is make sure you know where your audience tends to live. I mean, Facebook is another alternative. I used Facebook for my undergraduate dissertation to connect with community members who were typically above a 35-year-old threshold about their feelings and thoughts about the city of Fort Worth. So figure out where your audience is, and they might be in multiple places, but try and isolate where you network depending on the responsiveness and willingness to interact with said platform. Next, I think it's really important to kind of highlight here that out of all of those functions where I talked about the different like person-to-person events, networking for research, in my opinion, is the easiest. You don't really realize until you start networking how valuable your kind of email address is. So your kind of ac.uk, or if in the US or Australia, .edu, that email address for some reason, I'm sure there's kind of institutional, reputation, biases, whatever. People respond much more to that than they would to a Gmail. So make sure when you're networking with your university email. In my opinion, networking for research limits the amount of insecurities because, as I said earlier, as I alluded to, the object of research is not yourself. So you're not personally networking with them. You're using your research as an intermediary to network with someone else. The value is being driven through this kind of entity that you're researching rather than yourself. And so in my opinion, there's less fear of rejection because ultimately, if people don't have time to be involved in your research project, that's fine. It's not so much that it's a reflection on you and your approach. So in my opinion, it limits that. And student privilege, it's a huge thing. I think it's very you pay a lot of money to be in university. And so as an undergrad, as a postgrad, especially, using that opportunity to be as curious as you want about the world. And there's a kind of a bias here from the people that you're networking, especially professionals, that almost they don't feel like you're going to have that much of an impact with your work. So they tend to give you much more information because they don't think that you're going to do much with it. And then when you do, it's kind of quite surprising for them. So I've always used that as a little trick up my sleeve. Really, really important point here about strengths. If you're an introverted person, it's still definitely possible to network. It's just that you need to have that mindset shift that allows you to kind of operate in a kind of pseudo extroverted way. And there's a great book. I'm sure we've all got too much to read, but if there's something that you're interested in, it's a bit of pop psychology, Quiet by Susan Cain. And she talks about kind of how people who are typically more introverted can actually have much more of an impact on the world. And I definitely think that's true. I've learned to become more extroverted, but definitely still get socially anxious and that sort of thing. So make sure you know your strengths before you start networking. And if you've got similar projects with other people, see if you can network together and share contacts and that sort of thing. And that really helps. And ask your supervisors as well for introductions. This is more of a methodological page, but it will be relevant to you and also set the course for the next couple of examples. So you've got stratified sampling and snowball sampling. These are the two that I've typically used over the years to find out who I'm going to contact, why, and then personalizing the response, personalizing the approach. Stratified sampling, or as otherwise I'll call it, divide and conquer. So you essentially, if you've got a group of stakeholders that you're interested in, let's say around a specific case, you can divide them up into their groups, into their category groups. And then you can either randomly select or you can choose who you think will be the most valued stakeholder out of them. In your methodologies, when you write them, you're going to want to say that you did this a bit more systematically. But as you know, if you've done kind of dissertation work before, you always are kind of writing your research methodology after you've kind of done it. So I'm sure we'll know what to do in that instance. And the second is snowball sampling. So essentially referrals or introductions from people. If you have like kind of initial conversations with people, you can ask them to refer you in the general area. And what that does actually is it allows you to borrow from the rapport of the person who's referred you and allows you to kind of take that forward and gives much more credibility to your project to a wider network of people. So those really are the basics. And I have three examples now, one from my undergrad research, one from my postgrad research, and one from my just little side project thing that I've started. Is there any questions at this point while I have some water? All right, so first example. So each example is going to have context, approach, outcome, and reflections, just as a really simple structure. So the context behind this is I did my study abroad semester in Austin, Texas. Fort Worth is a city which is about 30 miles west of Dallas, big center for commerce and what have you in Texas. But no one's kind of heard of it before, or they hadn't heard of it anyway when I was researching it. And it was at the time the 15th largest city in the US. It's now up to 12th. There was kind of like literally no research on it, no urban research, no nothing. And that really fascinated me because it was a really nice like city, small town city. And it was becoming less of a small town city. So I wanted to investigate that. Evidently, I had no contacts in the region, none. All I had was this bed, which my cousins who lived in Fort Worth allowed me to stay there for a month with them. So this is how I started, and I imagine this is how it feels to start a new research project with no connections. So hopefully you can take from this example that it's not as hard and it's not impossible. So starting with zero, what did I do? I did some stratified sampling. I put it into business, government, and community. I was typically interested in urban identity from a kind of holistic standpoint. one of my markers, to my detriment, actually told me that this sounds more like a book chapter rather than a dissertation. Take that for what you will. So I was looking for a more kind of holistic approach. And so what was I doing? I was finding emails on the internet, as you do, and sending off emails. And I only sent one LinkedIn message because I was still very young at LinkedIn at this point. And I'll show you that LinkedIn message and we'll talk about it a little bit. It's not a particularly good example, and it shows how much I've kind of changed in the way that I'm networking. So I needed to go visit for a month from the 4th of July to the 2nd of August 2018. So I started networking in April. I don't think you typically need to start networking this early, depending on where it is. If you're doing it in a country abroad, you might want to start a bit earlier. But as you'll see in the email approaches and the other approaches that I show, I've really played on the fact that I'm British, because Texans and Americans typically like that quite a lot from mass media and what have you. So take that's a little disclaimer before you see the first approach. So this is the kind of typical email that I'd send, and there's a few things that I want to illustrate. The first is the subject line. If you've never contacted someone before, you've got to give them a pretty good reason. And there's all these statistics about, like, you've got to impress someone within the first 5 seconds or what have you. I don't know how true that is, but what I do know is that you have to get their attention. And the way that I did this was an excessive use of capitalization, and saying that British student requires interview. Now, if you saw that in your inbox, you'd probably be pretty petrified. And so in hindsight, it's probably not particularly the best approach. However, it worked. So hence why I'm showing you. And so you kind of say why you're writing to them, you tell them who you are. And then I had a bit of a personal connection. So why on earth would any British student be interested in Fort Worth? It's because I visited it when I studied abroad. Then you kind of blow the trumpet a little bit about the city and, whatever to, show interest. And then you tell them what you're doing. And then you have a kind of specific personalization. So you tell them what you want from them and why. So this person was the president and CEO of the Arts Council. And I wanted to understand from them, their perspectives. The last bit's one of the more important bits. You ask them if they want to be involved, but you don't particularly say that, like looking forward to hearing from you or whatever. That is like a no-no on cold emails. Don't say that. Don't put pressure on them to reply. So this is kind of the very typical email response, email approach that I did, and it works pretty well. It bounced around. I think it was like on an email chain of about 60, 70 emails. So it definitely did work. But I think I've got better at it since then. The LinkedIn approach, this is the only one I sent. And I've shown this one kind of out of comedic effect to myself. But essentially, it's very similar. It tells them why I'm contacting them. It tells them I'm a British student. Up until I would be interested in involving you, that's fine. And it's a little bit academic in terms of validity, integrity, and credibility. The last kind of paragraph is the reason why I don't think this is a particularly good message, but I hope you can see that I'm a serious and diligent individual who considers Texas a second. I think that's a bit overdone. But I think at the time I was just kind of like, how do I get this person's attention and make them think that I'm a credible person? And then I hope to hear from you soon. That's another example of something you shouldn't do. So I'm showing you this more because to be fair, it did work and I did get the interview, but I look back at it now and I cringe. So go on, Connor.
Oh, Daniel, really interesting stuff here. I was wondering, did you consider using flattery at all? Like, sort of first line or paragraph, so excited to see your work. or really interested to learn more about it, or something of that, some bit of slightly duplicitous flattery, especially in an American setting, because also there's the cultural thing you haven't mentioned there.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think more because they're professionals and they work in a kind of environment where their work is actually quite opaque, in the sense that you can't really see, if you're talking more, I suppose, to creatives, and you're talking even to academics.
Everybody likes a little bit of appreciation, Daniel. No, yeah.
Well, I did have a little bit of it in the previous one, where I was saying I was fascinated by the city and the kind of work that
exactly. Yeah.
So that there is a bit of that, of course, but it's important not to overdo it, because then you just sound like then it just definitely sounds like you're not very interested, and you're kind of just there for the recruitment of the participant rather than the kind of interaction. But it's a good point. I mean, I think depending on who you're talking to, it's contextual for sure. There's obviously a little bit of it, but as we'll see a bit later on, I didn't use it as often with the UK examples, because British people don't particularly like that. They kind of, are typically.
Oh my God, I've been doing it wrong all these years. Maybe it's an Irish thing. I
don't. Good question though, Connor. So yeah, this is just an example just to show you that. So what was the outcome? Before I had arrived, I'd organized 8 interviews with a range of different people: Arts Council, business, chambers of commerce, what have you. And I ended up with 35 interviews in the end, which is incredible considering how I had no contacts to start with. Just the kind of range, just to show you a range of the kind of things. I met the mayor of the city, which was very lucky. And also I became a cowboy for a day, which was very nice to experience that side of life. I don't think I'd go back to it again, but definitely a good experience. But you can see there who I kind of, just generally saw. So it's just a recognition that this does work, and that with a little bit of perseverance, you can kind of go quite far. Some reflections on this. I had definitely too many interviews. Don't do what I did here and get 35 interviews. That's just ridiculous. I did have like about 3 or 4 months to process that data, but yeah, it was much more stressful in the analysis than the collection. So it's basically just set yourself limits. And we'll see in the next example how I corrected for my overbearing kind of approach here. So the next example is my master's research, which was on smart mobility experimentation. The context is that I was interested in smart cities, hence why I did my master's. And so I wanted to analyze a case study that was near enough to science and technology studies, but also involved the geography element. So I found this one, and my supervisor had some contacts there, so that was, super helpful. And I started planning this, thinking that I was going to go see a self-driving car in action in this living lab, which is essentially a experimentation test zone, regulatory sandbox, that sort of thing. And then, as we know, this happened, and COVID meant that everything moved online. And so it was still a very similar approach, stratified and snowball sampling. But instead of, the big thing here was, instead of asking for interviews off the bat, I thought what would be a much more humble approach to go off was ask for like half an hour off the record chat to scope out who these people were and whether they could help me or whether they could refer me on. And so that was my approach, and I'll talk about a little bit about why that worked and why it didn't work a bit later on. So what was the approach? We'll see here that I didn't do much of that duplicitous kind of almost flirtatious flattery stuff here, because these people are British professionals who are, it's quite reclusive to that sort of thing. And similarly, there's a lot of changes here in terms of, like, I don't need to clickbait these people as much, because if I say I'm doing an MSc research projects, on mobility experiments, that already captures their attention, because you know, there's not a lot of translation to what the research like environment is in the UK to the work that they do. Is quite similar. This one I was referred to someone, so that middle bit there, you feel free to kind of get rid of that if you don't have it. But still very similar, along the same lines. I talked about literally more my experience and why I was specifically interested in this, because I thought that might be a bit more reassuring than kind of the previous approach. And then I was quite specific about what I wanted to discuss with them. And then this is where the off the record chat came, because I think everyone was because this was at the start of the pandemic, really. I think at the start of the pandemic, everyone was kind of quite edgy about, you know, spending too much time online, or spending time online with people they don't know, especially because of workplace monitoring tools and what have you. And I was able to offer you kind of mutual benefits. So I said, like, I'm happy to, like, when the results come out, do some work for you, and this never transpired, right? So it's important to offer it, but just don't worry that, like, most people will forget about it. So it's just there to kind of soften the blow of you asking them to help you with your research project, but oftentimes you won't actually have to help them. And then once again, the no commitment, really, really important. If you're not able to, but you know someone who is, I would appreciate any help you can provide. That's a really nice way to end a email. It doesn't require them to do anything. You've literally just asked them for a chat. There's no commitment there for a kind of wider discussion. So that's kind of the typical, and that was quite successful as well. LinkedIn, I use a lot more LinkedIn here. So LinkedIn, if you don't know what LinkedIn is, it's, you know, that platform that we were talking about slightly earlier. But essentially, if you don't have an existing connection, so the connections go in 1, 2, and 3. The first connections are people you're directly connected to. So say, for example, I'm directly connected to Connor. That would be, you know, there'd be a first connection between me and Connor. If Connor, sorry to use you here, Connor, but if Connor was connected to someone that I wanted to connect to, they would appear as a second connection to me because I've got a mutual connection through Connor. Okay. If it's a third connection, that means it's someone who is outside of both of our networks. So therefore, there's no kind of mutual introduction or contact. And sometimes you get 3+, and that essentially means, like, it's kind of like almost a warning. Like, there's no reason ever for you needing to contact this person because it's so far out of your network that they've had to put a plus next to it. But anyway, when you do contact people who are outside of your network, so outside your first connections, you have to send a request, and oftentimes it asks you, do you want to add a note? So when you're adding a note, like, I always add a note. Some people say you don't have to, but if you're coming kind of quite left field, if you're a researcher and you don't have, you know, extensive industry experience like I don't, it's always good to send a like kind of pre-connection note. And the one thing to remember about this is it's a maximum of 300 characters. So you can't go off the rails here. All you have to do is keep it really nice and concise. So mine was quite simple. I said who I was, I said what I'm doing, and I wanted to know if they wanted to have a chat about the Smart Mobility Living Lab. And I said, I'm keen to help you as well. So once again, giving mutual benefit. Then you get a connection with them, and so that pre-connection's there. And then the post-connection is, thanks for connecting with me. I would be interested in having a short call. Alternatively, I can send you more information. So you're giving them options. And then here you can say, look forward to hearing from you, because they've already answered your connection. So the look forward to hearing from you shouldn't happen before you've had initial contact. So the initial contact I've had here is they've recognized my profile, they've connected with me. And so I can kind of move forward with that, more of that kind of rhetoric. And this was also quite successful. Between May and June 2020, I had 30 chats with people. And this is, I'll show you on the next slide who this kind of was with. And then I only did 10 interviews in the end. And that was because I stratified the sampling even more, and I was able to be much more strategic with my time. But these 30 chats were essentially with these sorts of people, big big government, Innovate UK, big tech companies, academia, and it was a really, really good show, to be honest. I was quite lucky to be able to get, you know, all of these in chats and then some of them in interview. Reflection on this, I had a good balance of interviews, unlike, you know, the previous example. Initial chats are really risky. I didn't realize how risky this was until afterwards. Essentially what I didn't do, which I recommend you to do if you do decide to go down this route because of COVID, once you've had the chat with them, if you think that they're interesting and you'd want to schedule an interview with them, schedule it at the end of that meeting. Don't let it lag. What I did was I let it lag and then I lost like 50% of my interviews. So the reason it was 10 interviews in the end was actually not so much my doing, it was more my fault. So I would recommend you schedule, even if you don't wish to kind of maybe pursue that later on, you could just, you know, kind of cancel it at a later stage. And this is a COVID secure method, right? If this is online interviews, it's Zoom, it's Teams, it's recording that, it's transcribing that. Teams has a really good function for that if you're on Outlook with your institution. It's a really good kind of way to go about it. So that's kind of reflections on that. A last one that it's just more, this is more to promote what I'm doing now than actually show an example of anything. But essentially this is quite a fun little example that I started. So I started a newsletter. If you want to subscribe to it, feel free to subscribe. It's essentially about, it's an experiment in trying to bring different urban knowledges and voices together because I feel like, you know, we're all quite siloed in the way that we're thinking about cities. And what I wanted to do was essentially bring people together. So this was essentially a collaboration between research and networking, which are the two things I really enjoy doing. So for my first issue, I wanted to get 50 voices together. Now that's absolutely ludicrous considering that I have a PhD to do and other things, but I was like, okay, let's just give it a shot and see how far I get. A disclaimer that the first issue has not come out yet, but disclaimer, if you do subscribe, I did not achieve 50. And this was just kind of in a month's worth of trying. So what I did was it was essentially cold LinkedIn and Twitter messaging with people who I think would be involved in the city or have a view on the city. So it goes from left to right and then back to left. I said who I am, I said what I'm doing, I said what I want to achieve, and I said I only have 2 questions for you to answer if you want to be involved. So that was the 300 character one. And then if you go over to the right and you've got post connection, I sent a massive message essentially saying like where they can find the newsletter if they wanted to, what the questions were, and some kind of suggestions, what I would do for them in return, and then when I'd like it by. And because they'd already connected with me, I can say, look forward to hearing from you soon. Okay, keep safe. One of the big things that I hadn't mentioned previously that I'll mention here is that don't be afraid to follow up. If you've said to someone that you want something by this date, or if you haven't heard from them in a long time, people are busy, you know, we're all busy. And a little nudge here and there isn't rude, it's actually quite appreciated a lot of the time. So I sent a follow-up to a bunch of people saying I wanted to kind of briefly follow up. Appreciate that the start of the year is quite busy, right? So like maybe play it on the holiday, or maybe play it on that, like sometimes on emails. A really good one that I learned was appreciate that I could have got lost, and my message could have got lost in your inbox, you know. So like kind of like little cheesy phrases like that kind of soften the blow of like why you're following up, and then ask them to get back to you at a certain point. I tried Twitter as well. So I just sent messages. I did do some of that, what Connor was mentioning earlier with one of the academics that I mentioned. I said that I was really interested in their work and they'd influenced me a lot. They ended up replying, so I guess it worked. They didn't want to participate, but it doesn't really matter. And so this is kind of an approach you can use for Twitter. I also sent emails to existing contacts. So this contact was someone that helped me with my master's dissertation. And I had a clickbait title again, because they've got to have some reason to reconnect and recontact with you, especially if they're really busy. It's not clickbait because it's still true. You know, it's not like one of those YouTube videos that it's got nothing to do with the title. And then you put a reminder in there and like why you're contacting them. You tell them a little bit update about yourself, and the same sort of things. So quite standard. The outcome was like, this is why I said it's ludicrous. I sent 70 requests out, 60 of them in one day, and I got 20 completed responses. So it's not actually bad. It's pretty good. My reflection from this is that essentially anyone can do networking. This kind of idea of casual magic is definitely true. But that's kind of it. If you want to connect with me, I'm here. But I'm going to stop recording.